Hello, I'm Dr. Rex Koontz, and I'm going to speak with you today about visual culture and visual analysis. The two really form a whole in the discipline of art history and related disciplines that take the forms, the shapes, the visual appearance of things as something very meaningful and something embedded in culture. We're going to look at several things today, everything from an ancient Greek statue to the design of MP3 players, and we're going to try to tease out how the shape of these things might be meaningful to the people who made them and to us today. And we're also going to talk about the meaning embedded in things that are in fact connected to words and to literature and to storytelling, because a lot of visual information that we get is actually related to telling stories and is not just about its shape. You've been asked to read two pieces or two extracts from very, very important works. One is an extract from Malcolm Gladwell's Blink, and the other is an extract from a classic art history piece by Michael Baxandall. I want to start with some ideas that Malcolm Gladwell presents in his work Blink. As you know, he's interested in how people immediately perceive differences and similarities and how they use that information then to make what we would call snap judgments or pre-conscious judgments, and how doing that is extremely important. Now, we do this all the time in art history and in other areas of visual culture. If you're the director of a commercial, if you're the director of this piece, if you're a photographer, you know immediately what's going to work and what is not going to work in a particular sequence or in a particular photograph. Gladwell is absolutely fascinated by how that works, and he takes his test study as the Getty Kouros case. And what you see in front of you is the Getty Kouros in two different views. Now, one of the reasons that these sculptures are so important is that they define the very beginning of the Greek sculptural tradition, the ancient Greek sculptural tradition. They show up a little bit before 600 BC, and they're made in exactly this way for about the next 140 or 150 years. And since Greek art has a foundational place in all of Europe and American art, since we really trace back in many ways our artistic practices and our artistic tastes in one way or another to ancient Greece, studying these things has become more than a cottage industry. It's a very, very big deal. We're getting at the root of things. And so consequently, since there are very few of these so-called Kouros figures, they're extremely valuable and in the many millions of dollars in the current art market. And they also cause a lot of ink to be spilled every time a new one is found or when an old one gets some sort of revision. So you can imagine the sort of excitement and all the money that circulated when out of nowhere a fairly pristine Kouros figure, a fairly pristine, almost life-size statue appears on the art market in the late 70s, early 80s. And that's, of course, then eventually what is acquired by the Getty. Now, as you know, Gladwell tells the story of a lot of important art historians' first meeting with the Getty. And one of the things that happened immediately for a couple of really important people, Thomas Hoving, the former director of the Metropolitan Museum, is one that Gladwell brings up, is a sense of revulsion. They felt slightly nauseous. They felt like something was profoundly wrong in the universe as soon as they looked at this. Now this, when you think about it, is a strange reaction to something that, you know, on first glance does not look particularly disturbing in any sort of slasher film or ghoulish or monstrous way. So why did they have such an intense physical reaction? And Gladwell begins to in fact, explore this intense physical reaction as a sort of one of these sort of unconscious snap judgments that we make all the time as human beings. Now, the important thing here is that Thomas Hoving and other people that he's talking to and sort of holding this dialogue about the Getty Kouros with is that they are experts. They have seen every one of these kouroi that exist, the plural of Kouros. They have, in fact, looked deeply and closely at these things. And what Gladwell proposes is that by looking deeply and closely, constantly, and by developing a critical sense and a sort of storehouse of visual information about these things, they know immediately when something's wrong, like a great pitching coach knows immediately when a pitcher has gotten off his rhythm or is releasing at the wrong point, or a great tennis coach knows when the tennis player's stroke is not quite right. They know it instantaneously. And so this revulsion that they felt with the Getty Kouros for Gladwell was really important, because if they've got all of this storehouse of information and they're looking at this and they're saying something's not quite right. In fact, one of the interviewees talked about the fact that it's as if the people who were trying to sell this had never really seen anything come out of the ground. There was something just too pristine, shiny. The surface wasn't right. It was beat up in certain places. It had a certain patina, something we like to call that surface after things have been buried, get a patina. But it was not consistent, and even that patina did not look right. Well, there were some chemical analyses that you can do of stone that in fact look at some of the detritus, some of the things that should be left around in stone that had been out of the ground for a long time, or had been worked a long time ago, I should say, that were authentically ancient statues. And these chemical analyses seem to indicate that the Getty was authentic, that it was really made between 550 and 600 BC or so, or sometime in the 6th century BC, and that they had the real thing. And so the director of the Getty, the curator of ancient art, Marion True at the Getty, everybody said, well, it's science, it has to be right. And so they ended up paying enormous sums of money, many tens of millions of dollars, for this Kouros. And all the while, Hoving and some of the other experts remained skeptical. They remained nauseous in front of this thing. There just was not, it was not right. So flash to 5 years or so later, and it turns out that people discovered that that chemical signature that they used to authenticate the Kouros was in fact, or could be, faked by a fairly simple chemical experiment involving potatoes and other things that Gladwell talks about. But the point is, at a very low cost and at a very low tech sort of level, you can create this same chemical signature and distribute it over a statue, and it's going to test as if it was ancient. Well, then the floodgates open, and some other things came to light, and the initial reactions of Hoving and others people started paying a lot more attention to them, and eventually the pendulum sort of swung the other way. And now people, in general, the scholarly consensus is that the Getty Kouros is a fake, and that the Getty was swindled out of many, many millions of dollars. And this is a story as old as the hills. People have been faking art for a very, very long time. And on the other side, kind of like an arms race, people have been developing more and better techniques for finding these fakes out, for, in fact, unveiling them as fakes. The art market is a very powerful incentive for people to suss these things out, and it's an equally powerful incentive for people to do them in the first place. And so we've had this going on for a very long time. Now, one of the things that is very clear to me and to everyone else who does art history, does any sort of visual cultural analysis, is the moral here is not that you should always and forever trust experts, or that science is somehow bunk or anything of that sort. But the moral lies in how these people amassed such visual knowledge and expertise in the first place, that they could simply come in front of this thing and snap nausea, snap, discomfort in front of something that wasn't right. And I think I already alluded to this. The mechanism is a lot of very careful looking. It's an enormous experience with whatever objects you become expert at. You have to live with these things. You have to feel them. You have to look at all of them in the corpus. You have to have a very close relationship with what you're actually doing, just as sports coaches know exactly what a good pitching motion should be like, and they know when somebody gets off immediately. This is what these art historians, curators in museums, this is one of the skills that they amass and in fact sort of make their living on, is this visual expertise, this ability to immediately put into play an enormous visual storehouse. For example, here we've got a tested, authentic Kouros figure on the right, and we've got the Getty Kouros on the left. Now, to the naive eye, and to me when I first started looking at these, there is very little difference. But what each one of these experts in the Gladwell piece realized is that there are these subtle little sharp edges. Everything is a little too defined, well defined in the Getty Kouros. And if you look at the mid-torso on each of these, you will see that that is in fact the case. If you look at just specific details without concentrating on the whole, without getting overwhelmed by all that visual data, and you just compare specific details, you see that in fact there is very subtle differences in the treatment of the Getty Kouros on the left and the attested authentic Kouros on the right. And again, they've looked at not only that authentic Kouros, but literally dozens, hundreds of pieces that came from that era, and they know how the sculptors worked, how each transition between the mid-torso and the hip went. They know how they treat the ribs. They know how they get the musculature of the upper arm. And any differences, even subtle, in these treatments is going to set off an alarm unconsciously in their visual database. And that's how they can make these snap judgments, which Gladwell argues are incredibly important. Now, if we go back in history and we talk about building up these visual skills that allow people to do such things that Gladwell finds so important and so basically fundamentally human, we end up with this guy, Giovanni Morelli. Giovanni Morelli was really studying to be a doctor, but he never practiced. He became entranced with art and with the abilities that he was developing to tell artworks from, or I should say authentic artworks from frauds, and to be able to differentiate one older Italian painter from another even when the paintings have not been signed. He was in fact a sort of he was a great differentiator of things. He was a great categorizer of artworks. And in Italy, in the late 19th century, this was in fact a very good thing to be. And we're going to talk about why it was in just a minute. But what I want to focus on for the moment is this idea that he is the father of connoisseurship, something that you see there on the right of your screen. Connoisseurship is the label that we now give to these people who have these expert visual skills, and these abilities to finely differentiate between paintings, painters, schools, areas, fakes, and authentic. And Morelli, being a doctor, had already a particular sort of skill set that he simply moved over to art history, the study of visual culture, the study of works of art. And he's going to use really something that's going to become popular only a little later with the stories of Sherlock Holmes. And he's going to propose that it's not the big important things that really lead you to good decision making, good differentiation, good visual acuity. It is in fact those unconscious little marginal things that you have to pay attention to, like maybe the Kouros rib area that we were looking at earlier. That's what's going to give you in fact the skills and the comparative corpus, the comparative elements that will allow you to then differentiate authentic from fake, to differentiate Verrocchio from Leonardo da Vinci, to do all these sorts of things that were in fact becoming very important at the time, because in the 1880s and 1890s in Italy, we were getting the rise of the collecting of old masters. There was a lot of money pouring into Italy that wanted old master Italian Renaissance and Baroque paintings. And somebody had to be the authority of what they were getting. Are they getting a real Da Vinci? Are they getting one of any number of fakes? Are they getting a real Michelangelo? Or are they getting somebody who studied with Michelangelo who looks kind of like him? You were talking about the difference in what today would be many millions of dollars, depending on what they were getting, since a lot of these were not signed. You had the rise of authority to tell these collectors and tell these people what they were actually getting. So what Morelli does in this unconscious trace technique is he focuses on absolutely marginal things, things that we wouldn't pay any attention to otherwise. And Morelli's favorite thing is to focus on the ear. And I think that it's not inconsequential that he was a doctor. He focuses on these sort of marginal bits of anatomy that in fact are often important to doctors, and doctors have to focus on in the same sort of way. They can't pay attention to the whole body. They just have to focus on this one aspect or element of it, the heartbeat, the sound of your lungs, that sort of thing. And they have to know what that single element means in relation to what is normal and healthy, or what is endemic of or indicative of a particular sickness, etc. So doctors already, in many ways, in the diagnostic moves that they make, often focus on one element and then compare it to that same element in a wider population of sick and healthy people. This is what Morelli does. He said, these are all Verrocchio, the late 15th century painter who's incredibly important, but doesn't have a huge corpus and was very, very sought after in the late 19th century. And so what Morelli does is he masters the way that Verrocchio treats ears, and he can tell immediately if it's actually Verrocchio painting the face and the ears, or if it's someone else. Because painters don't spend a lot of time on those ears. They do them all usually in more or less the same way because they know no one's really looking at them. And so it's a sort of unconscious movement that they get down pat and they do it and they do it. And Morelli's genius is in recognizing that, and in recognizing that if you just really train yourself to identify, to be able to identify these marginal details in particular painters, then if someone who's faking Verrocchio doesn't pay really close attention to the ear, and it's highly likely that they won't, they'll spend all their time on the central face and the eyes and the things we like to look at. If they don't spend the same amount of time and care on the ear, They are going to be found out by Morelli, because Morelli is going to identify that as an ear that Verrocchio wouldn't paint. So this unconscious trace becomes the trace of connoisseurship. It becomes the element that serves these investigators, these first art historians, in their quest for the authentic versus the fake, and in their abilities to differentiate different artists. At the same time, and here's some more Verrocchios, and in fact a Verrocchio painting on the left, attested, fairly widely authenticated. We really believe this is Verrocchio. And then a school of Verrocchio drawing on the right. In the 1880s and 1890s, when Morelli is really fleshing out this working method, again, people are pouring into Italy wanting Verrocchios, and they will pay very good money for them. And so you get Morelli, who can tell you if this is a Verrocchio or not, that you're not going to get burned on this investment. And this becomes an extremely important sort of hand-in-hand movement of the art market on one hand needing this skill, and on the other, Morelli and, as we're going to see very soon, some Americans who get into it, who also are going to develop this skill and serve as intermediaries between the art of the Italian Renaissance, or for that matter, ancient Greece and Rome, and the art market. And the person who's most important for art history and for the study of visual culture in general is Bernard Berenson. He becomes the consultant, the sort of Morellian consultant to all these great American collectors, J. Pierpont Morgan, a lot of other people that you would probably recognize or have their name on banks, or some of the titans of American finance and industry in the 19th century. And their families have remained so for a very long time. These are the people who built the Metropolitan Museum and other great art institutions in the United States. This is the age of the museum. So they go see Berenson in the 1890s, who has learned these techniques and methodologies from Morelli, and in fact, if anything, has made them more profound and more precise. He lives in Italy, and he eventually ended up in Villa I Tatti, which is now Harvard's Center for Italian Renaissance Studies. At the end of his life, he gave it to Harvard, and it continues to serve as a sort of laboratory for the study of Italian Renaissance painting and other aspects of culture. So they would go to him, and they would bring him a picture that they were interested in, or he might suggest pictures that he had seen around and say, I really believe that this is a real early Michelangelo. And even better, if nobody knows this, or if nobody suspects this, then you could probably get a pretty good deal on it. So again, the art market and the rise of this, or the development of visual skills and visual acuity that were eventually going to play a big role in art history and the study of visual culture in general, happened in the late 19th century here, specifically in conjunction with these Morelli and Berenson figures, and the fact that the great museums are now collecting, the great collectors are amassing extensive private collections of this ancient art, and they need visual intelligence to make sure that these collections are solid, are authentic, are worth something. And the Metropolitan, which is collecting this stuff, at a very brisk pace between 1890 and the crash of 1929, is not only talking to Berenson, but they're developing their own stable of curators who are developing competing visual skills in this area. And so is Philadelphia and Boston. And in fact, we're getting an explosion of the first real wave of art historical studies and connoisseurship in the United States. And the great collections that you're walking through in the Met and all over the East Coast are built around this time, especially the ancient and Italian Renaissance collections, and even some of the medieval collections, things that were valued at that time. So we come back to the Gladwell incident and the Getty Kouros, and the fact that this was not only a huge financial loss for the Getty, but it in fact questioned their legitimacy as a great museum institution in the United States. I mean, it was just a lose-lose situation for them, and it all goes back to the abilities of their visual specialists. So again, I want to make this point, and Gladwell makes this point, I think, quite well, that these skills continue to play really interesting roles in our own national museum culture and visual culture in general. But I think if we limited it to the art market, that would be a sad and incredibly short-sighted thing to do. If we limited visual connoisseurship and the study of the close, critical study of visual things to an art market sort of, thumbs up or thumbs down authenticity or categorizing painters, that really would be a short-sighted way of dealing with what Gladwell and others have argued is an incredibly important human skill. So we've got ears and we've got expertise built up by looking at things very closely and very critically over long periods of time. That's a skill that is not limited to these sorts of situations, I will argue. And in fact, you wonder at times when you walk through a museum here in Houston, or even more a gallery, and you look at contemporary art, the contemporary visual world in Houston, and especially as it is embodied in art, and you look at these things and you go, it's very difficult to think of the Getty Kouros and the sort of fine anatomical differentiations one can make with those things, because you're talking about recognizable subject matter in the case of the Getty Kouros and in Italian painting and etc. And what we have often today, not entirely certainly, but what we have oftentimes is a real care and deliberation in the abstract units that go into making the artwork, in things like line or blobs of color or particular shapes that may or may not resolve themselves into a Madonna and Child or a young male nude figure, as in the case of the Kouros. And here we have one of the most famous American painters of the post-World War II generation, Jackson Pollock, his Full Fathom 5 from 1949. And initially when you face this painting, you may think what Dr. Koontz has been talking to me about earlier does not apply. It has no, in fact, I can't figure out what the criteria are for this. But when you look at this closely, and let's zoom in on details, in fact, you could argue it's pretty easy to simply treat it as these small visual details that we're looking at, like the tiny parts of the ribs in the Kouros figures, to take those small details and simply let them play among themselves. That they don't have any representational value. That's why it's called abstract art. That you are simply watching the play, almost as if you're listening to music and you're just listening to the play of notes, especially abstract music without any lyrics. You're listening to jazz and you're simply listening to where the saxophone is taking you. And in a lot of ways, that's what the great commentators on Pollock want you to do with this painting. They want you to follow these white splashes down through the painting and then follow the loop up of the black line on the other side of this painting and do this visual dance, this sort of visual sonata that is encoded in all of these lines and splashes and colors that Pollock has placed on the canvas. Abstract art, in many ways, approaches the kinds of appreciation we like to give to music, in the sense that we're really dealing with abstract relationships of sensual things. In the case of music, it's sonorous elements, and in the case of art, it's visual elements here. And you can use a lot of the same visual acuity to then construct the stories of how these things work abstractly and visually. You use those same sorts of abilities. For example, this entire painting, Full Fathom 5, is really organized around two central axes, I would argue. One, the loop up and around of this great black line, which seems to be applied in one amazingly fluid, continuous gesture. And the other is these large splashes of white, off-white paint that fall down through the center of the canvas and off to the lower right-hand side. And these two form a sort of X across the center of the painting, really anchoring you in the painting and allowing your eye to make some sense of the larger composition. And in fact, visual analysts of all stripes, art historians, other analysts of visual culture, will often point out how these compositions fit together as a whole. And those are skills that we certainly cannot treat in the course of a single lecture. But the analysis of composition and how things are in fact laid out on a canvas or on any sort of support, rectangular or otherwise, and how it all works together is a really big skill developed over the course of the 20th century. Now, if you sort of, instead of looking straight at the canvas and paying attention only to these fine visual details and the relationships that we talked about being developed from Morelli onwards, if you go up into the stratosphere and sort of enter a satellite looking down on post-World War II Earth, there are these two huge titans really wrestling for world supremacy in many ways. One is, of course, the United States, and the other was Soviet Russia. I do not think that it is an accident of history that Soviet Russia chose as their official art style, as their overriding art style, something that is incredibly realist, incredibly really sort of backward-looking in many ways. When you think about the development of art history, they would show their leaders in these heroic poses, easily recognizable subject matter that you see on your right. This is, in fact, a portrait of Stalin. While at the same time, Americans have lost subject matter, recognizable subject matter altogether. They have not lost the naturalist, they have jettisoned, really, the naturalistic art tradition for something that is abstract. And one of the reasons that they did this is because that for them, they could talk about abstract art as more free, as allowing the artist more freedom, just as in the larger discourse between Soviet Russia and the United States could talk about their political system, democracy, as being more free than the Soviet communist system. This trope of freedom, this sort of central, fairly poorly defined but highly charged word, freedom, must be understood beside this painting that really resonates with the same sorts of ideas. Freedom on the left, a sort of controlled proletarian heroism on the right. And in fact, energy, that America was this young country taking over for old Europe, was also part of this, that Pollock was literally flinging paint around, felt right to a lot of American commentators. Not only is that more free, and that Pollock is the exemplary American artist because he's freer than his Soviet counterparts, but he's also more energetic. He's also more lively than his European and Russian counterparts. And this idea that Americans are the action people, that Americans and the American way of life embodies energy as opposed to the old world and its sort of clunky old, sort of matured, overly matured ways, was a real idea for these people, even if it was subconscious. And what's really interesting is that before World War II, America did not have this same idea of itself, nor did it constantly harp on these terms of freedom and energy. And the art style did not, to any huge extent, value those sorts of spontaneous, energetic expressions. There was certainly some lively painting, but it was much more, it was based on a naturalistic approach to the human body. It was based on recognizable narratives before World War II, and in fact it had, in many ways, some of the same social goals as did Soviet realism, that they wanted to educate people. You'd put them in post office, in schools, in public places. American muralism had important social goals as well. After World War II, this is all wiped away by the action painting aesthetic that proposes freedom and energy are the key American ways of being. And in fact, I come from a place not far from Dallas, Texas, and in that city, in the 50s and through the 60s, they systematically covered over the pre-World War II murals. A great Fair Park was in fact almost completely whitewashed by the time I was a kid, and you couldn't even see these murals anymore. They had literally disappeared from the landscape. And what you could see is you could go to the Dallas Museum of Art, and I did quite often, and other regional art institutions, and you could see Jackson Pollocks, and you could see the explosion of American creativity after World War II. And so it's not just Pollock, I guess is the point I'm making. Franz Klein here, very, very highly valued post-World War II painter. Barnett Newman, we have some important Barnett Newman pieces here in Houston as well. These are guys who did not look back once they jettisoned the naturalistic approach to the human body and recognizable narrative, and instead really wanted to explore painting as paint, as the application of paint to a canvas. They felt that not only was freer, but it was more honest. If I'm a great painter, I can make you feel something simply by the way I put paint on a canvas and the way I organize these materials. In some ways, going back to Morelli and Berenson, those very, very fine visual distinctions that they would make became the entire game. In fact, that became what one did as an appreciator of art. But I think it's important to keep in mind that none of that would have happened without the idea of freedom becoming so central to American self-identity. Without the opposite end of the spectrum in Soviet Russia. In some ways, it's just as important that Pollock was completely anti-Soviet as it was that he was completely free in that way. Everybody who looked at Pollock knew, boy, that's not a Russian painter. And vice versa. Everybody in Moscow who looked at the great Soviet realist paintings, or I should say the big Soviet realist paintings, because very few people consider them truly great. Anybody who looked at that would, in fact, identify that as Soviet, as my art, and not that decadent, weird art of the Americans. When we look at things other than art, can we use any of this? Can we use our critical visual skills of detailed critical analysis of elements? Can we use this idea that we can plumb the depths of the culture for organizing principles or major ideas or tropes or ways of organizing themselves, and see that art somehow plays off them in important ways? Can we do this with non-art? Can we do this with other aspects of our visual culture? And my answer is an unequivocal yes. All one has to do is look at anything from car design to iPods to the way we organize advertisements to the aesthetics that go on in our popular movies or TV shows to popular music itself, the way we dress. All of that is regimented in ways that are similar to these these conversations that art has with itself. For example, teapot design, something that is in many ways sort of a socially unconscious trace throughout history. One just buys an appropriate teapot, right? It's got a function. You want to make tea. But no, that's anything almost would make tea. There's lots of things that would make tea. But in fact, we have a special object that is given certain design aesthetics, certain design principles, depending on the era, the class of the person who's buying it, the things that they want to project to other people. The person who buys the teapot on the left, a contemporary designer teapot, does not want to communicate the same things as someone who collects and or uses 19th century British teapots on the right. And in fact, if we had a time machine and went back to the 19th century, British tea drinkers would have a completely different set of interests in many ways when they looked at a teapot than do these modern designers, the people who buy modern design. The people who buy modern design are hooking into a whole conversation that goes back to Germany in the 1920s and early 1930s at a place called the Bauhaus, when they're talking about how do we meld form and function? How can we make beautiful things for all people? There's a current department store who is in fact following in those footsteps and those desires, Target, who is all about trying to bring good design to the masses. And in fact, oftentimes they will commission great designers to do specific Target things. And in fact, you would probably find something like the teapot on the left at a Target store, well, while you might not at other stores, other sort of big box stores that sell teapots. You might find something a lot more like the one on the right that would be considered traditional, and that's what a teapot is supposed to look like, etc., and has been for a long time. Now, there's a whole other set of identities that goes with that. You could, in fact, if you're doing market research or you're writing art history books on the impact of teapot design and the shape of their audiences, you would know that on the left, you should look at the education and class of these people who want these modern teapots and want to project this modernist sensibility to others versus those who would like a good knockoff from China of the British teapot on the right for a very small sum. Thank you, that's good, it will make my tea. And that's what Michael Baxandall is really talking about. What we're doing with Baxandall and what you should be getting out of Baxandall is his ability to marry all of these visual cues and the world that those paintings inhabited and put it all together into culture and a visual analysis where he finds the signs using these critical visual skills of what people were really interested in back then, and notes how that worked into the culture of the time. In other words, it's a social art history. It's an art history that believes that looking and appreciating and talking about art is the product of an historical milieu. And if you understand that historical milieu, you can understand a lot more why particular artworks circulated in the way they did, why they meant what they did, why some were important and others perhaps weren't. And this is not the same thing as knowing how to tell a Verrocchio from something else so you can use that information on the art market. It uses the same skills that are developed. We've all developed the skills throughout the 20th century, and in fact from the late 19th century on, in some relation to an art market. But that's not the only place that these skills can be used. They can enrich our sense of history, and specifically how visual objects played a role in history. And that's one thing I'm very interested in, and that I hope you would be interested in as you further your studies in comparative cultural studies. One of the richest mines of information on culture is the visual. And over the last 120 years, we have developed fairly fine-grained, important and exciting, and often very productive analytical tools that allow us to get at that visual, to talk about it with some sense of nuance and with some sense of a critical intelligence. And Baxandall, Michael Baxandall's work that you're to read is in fact one of the greatest examples, still cited by many art historians as the great social art history text. Now, what Baxandall does for the Italian Renaissance, people are starting to do for our own era. And this is, to me, extremely interesting because it brings all these visual skills, all these analytical skills, to bear on things that are happening to us right here and right now. And it really adds to the cultural dialogue in some very important ways. And I'll give you just one example to end my discussion of visual culture and visual analysis, and that is the design of the MP3 player. You have an early Rio player, MP3 player on your left, and you have the latest iteration of the smallest iPod made by Apple on your right. It's clear who won this competition, and believe me, it is a competition. What these companies are trying, who are making MP3 players, are trying to do is to get you to think of their design and their look and their feel even as the thing that an MP3 player is, or is the best thing that an MP3 player is. And one of the things that's happened, and this is due to Jonathan Ives and other people who work in design at Apple, is that the extremely clean, minimal approach to these objects has won out. Anything that you pick up from an iPhone to the smallest iPod is all about being exceptionally simple to work. Look at the early Rio. It looks like maybe you could work your space capsule with that remote alone, whereas all you're going to do with the small iPod is play music, and it's that beautiful, elegant simplicity that really captured the market. And even the iPhone, when you just look at it, when the screen's off, it is a very simple instrument, and the idea of just touching something to make it work also is simplicity itself. Now, an enormous technological expertise had to be developed to make all that work, but much of that technological expertise was used in the service of a very powerful but very simple design aesthetic. Now, what that says about us and what we want out of our MP3 players, or how we look at larger design issues in general, is not something that I'm going to go into here. But if you read Baxandall, and even if you read Gladwell, and you know that these initial visual experiences are extremely important to us as human beings, then you know that there is a game afoot, that there's some meaning or meanings to be gleaned from this movement from, space-age techno rocket launcher to the most simple, elegant player that mankind has yet to invent, which are these iPods. And that movement has something to say about larger cultural movements, larger cultural issues. What that is really for you to write.